Hello.
Hi. Hello, good morning.
Morning. I don't know if you want to start with something.
I can do some very, very broad updates.
Why don't you go ahead with your short updates and we can go from there.
So, my very broad updates for this week are, as we somewhat discussed, in the open source meeting for a little bit, the sort of main event was the neuromatch mentoring sessions this week, and as a whole, I actually really liked that happened, and I'm really glad to have been a part of it. If it's too noisy here, let me know. I'll try.
It's fine. That's fine.
Nothing too major from them to say, other than I'm really glad that it was there, and I think I'm really glad that it happened, and I am curious if someone from one of the many things we want to check out the lab. I think you kind of said the same thing. Someone might be interested in that too. But it's a really interesting primer for me. Most of my updates are sort of in the realm of like future. Like I'm getting very excited about the upcoming sort of fall semester stuff, and I want to do things there. I really want to. Maybe that's something we can briefly talk about today. Is just thinking about like internships and things we might want to offer, or like if there's specific things we want to put out there so people coming into the fall semester can do, or look at or get excited about or start posting. So we're there, and I'm not 100% finished with all of my GeoPro administrative infrastructure work, but it's basically ready. Like all the things I've been trying to do on that side of things up there. So things will be kind of returning more to normal as August completes, turns to September, in terms of like reading groups and events and projects. But the mentoring sessions definitely made it a visceral thing of like, okay, there are people here, there are people curious about this stuff, you want to do these things. As I said last time, it was really a pleasant surprise to hear someone just kind of outrightly say, yeah, I'm really interested in studying embodied intelligence. And so just kind of as a reminder, like, even though sometimes it feels very, very, very niche, or like just not mainstream, if we have stuff ready to do the things that we want to do, and then people come across it, they'll have a lot to connect to. I don't think I'm going to have time to do something like the following, but like I would really like to like do something very specific, like a continuation of developmental brain vehicle stuff. Like there's something there that could happen, and I know I'm really meandering here, but I think one of the things I really like to do or advertise for essentially an assistant lab manager, or even if they're experienced enough, a lab manager or like virtual lab manager. Like it could go into social media or other things like that. But someone who is interested in spending some time with lab administrative stuff. And what I mean by that specifically is there's certain very small things and given my experience in the lab right now, I think I know better how to direct those efforts than before. As a side note, like I think I'm very happy to do things with Notion, but I think for project management and development of ideas, things, keeping that away from Notion is a change that I might make more intentionally. And by that I specifically mean just having a templated structure of essentially Google Docs and a formalization of some of the project things that's very accessible is something that I think between that and just implementing, with someone else or with myself, then with you or whoever wants to do it, but going through these different project spaces in the lab and kind of giving them a little touch up, but then also, making them, it's sort of the balance between, if one wanted to, they could simply just go through all these different project spaces and make them, a presenter, make them more project oriented, or make them more like a thing ready to do in that sense. And I realized that almost certainly won't happen at like every instance of what we could do in that space. But and I don't like, I would be really surprised if we find someone who wants to do that. That's great. But I think much more likely is for a few key specific places we find someone who's somewhat interested in doing that kind of nitty-gritty work, but we work with them to basically get some things into a much more like ready to launch, or like, where to pick things up, because I think so much of the work is just where to pick things up and then where to sort of parking the car on the downhill slope kind of idea. And like, can we take some cars that are like almost in the junkyard and clean them up and then put them on a downhill slope, so when someone is ready to drive them and go somewhere, they're ready. And I don't think that's gonna potentially be like a sexy thing to advertise for, but like that's the work that I think needs to be done for certain things to be a little more easier to happen. So it's balancing the raw nature of the work versus things people actually want to do. So that's a little bit deep in the weeds, and it's a little bit of an idealization, because I know the counter argument to all of that is, in the current situation that we have is mostly about just getting people to do what they want to do, and that's great, right? So it's a bit of a balance, but I feel like there are ways to do some structuring of that, and it ties into things I'm doing with GoPro, ties into a few things, maybe a few things with plot twisters that are happening or will be happening. I'm not quite sure, but there's a little bit of some emergent, things in that space. So I don't know if there's anything that might be a segue to a discussion, or to let's talk more about that later, or let's have a lab administration meeting next week or something like that. I don't really know how you're feeling about what I said there. There's a couple other things I might say, but otherwise that's I have a few other broader updates, but that was a very in-depth thing about lab stuff. So I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, so I guess we should try to have a lab meeting this coming week, because we need to kind of plan out for the fall. And, that's always our time to hit some of these, bringing new people into the lab, kind of updating initiatives, all that. So I would like to have one.
Excuse me.
And I think, okay.
Part of that is like, I want to reach out to both, honestly, UC San Diego, where I am currently. Mm-hmm. If there's some things there that I'm looking to discuss. And there's even some certain that I forgot about, I'm remembering now, like data science efforts that I'm interested in furthering a bit more. And some things even from like the NLP course that I really liked, or like the NLP and the capstone I did on, I think it was mental health data sets and expanding understanding bias in terms of mental health and something like that. That was a really fun project, and I think there's I'm sure there's actually like a ton of data science ethics internships somewhere, but making some things around that kind of topic would be interesting here too, and fairly tenable. Like I don't think it would be hard. And one of the big things that I'm intentionally focusing on with JoPro is like I want to, seed or like sort of research incubator and then vocation incubator, and like I'm really trying to give very specific opportunities, like somewhat niche opportunities that may be harder to find, like that starting initial experience, that starting getting used to writing there, maybe getting it preprint, maybe developing a project, but like the things that are a little bit more harder to find. So that I don't think data ethics is one of them per se, but doing some of that in the way that we have a really interesting legacy in that space already, both in terms of society and technology, but also like some of the cultural things, even how we've been looking at like research. Like there are ways that could bridge really easily into like scientific management, research management, all the sort of like the way we've talked about like what influences fields of development, or we came very close to doing some things on ethics boards and how things are implemented at tech organizations too from that angle. So I mean, there's a lot there. But I want to reach out to UCSD. I definitely need to reach out to UAlbany and reconnect with them. I believe some of the structuring has changed there, but there's still interesting potential for what we're doing. And I really appreciate like we partnered with both the research undergraduate research group at the time, and then some, of course, and that's a really cool that's a really cool thing that happened, and it could happen again. And then also like kind of the newer stuff that I'm excited about, and if I could harness things here, there's some opportunities with Boston area stuff, and I feel like I'm kind of talking like I'm trying to take over 3 major American U.S. cities in this, which isn't the case necessarily, but like there's some like both Boston local things and I just have a little bit more access to it's like if you're if you're a certain student at certain universities, like the classic one that probably everybody knows about, like if you're an MIT student, you can do things at Harvard sometimes, and there's a lot of, and that's not unusual. Like when there's the proximity of stuff here is just so close, so it's this element of like understanding a bit more certain networks in those spaces that would be really interesting to explore and do some things. Both some of it will be more than a mental health working group, like we have people doing things in the social work space here. We have things in I think that one of the things that I will sort of do a grand opening of will be the mental health working group. I think one of the titles I had for it was like mental health paradigm and perspectives or something like that, like something kind of bland and large, but with the idea of what we've been looking at the DSM, we've been looking at these other things, we talked about Inside Out, we talked about like internal family systems, and I looked at polyvagal theory recently, and I want to look more at that and see a bit of like where's the science on it, and what's sort of the edge of a variety of things and implementation. So I mean that's in the docket too. But mostly it will be about getting the ducks in a row so I can talk to these different groups and institutions and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Can we advertise for interns? Can we advertise for projects we're working on or whatever, and go from there. So that's in my mind is things I'm trying to push forward through this weekend. Yeah, maybe we can meet next week. I don't know what time you'd like to meet, but we can talk about lab stuff, future stuff. But that's sufficiently. There's more I can say, like more details, but that's my update for today.
Well, good. Yeah, thanks for the update. I think there's a lot there. First thing is that we do want to have a lab meeting or a research meeting, probably in the afternoon sometime. In maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, maybe Wednesday.
I think all the neuromat, because I don't know if you're doing like the project metric stuff, but I think neuromat is kind of coming to a close, right? So we have a little time for that stuff.
Yeah, last week was the last week. So we had 2 weeks of mentorship.
Okay.
And more on that in a minute. But yeah, we'll find a time, probably Wednesday, because I teach 3 hours on Tuesday. I don't have a lot of patience left after that for meetings. But
okay.
yeah, so yeah, and then there are a lot of things kind of in the hopper here. We have I have a independent study course this fall, and I think that's like model building. So that's something that might be.
That's the course is all about model building?
Well, it's not a course. It's like sort of an independent study where
okay.
I have a couple of students and we're working on building models. So I'm going to be generating a lot of. We're going to be generating a lot of discussion, maybe some materials on that.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where that goes or help out with that, because I know that's been that was always like the thing that you mentioned, like, well, let's have an internship called Model Builder, or like someone with a title about Model Builder. So like that's cool. I'm very curious to see how that goes. It'll be good.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do with that. I mean, it's like from data science to a lot of the open source models, and like just digging into it and seeing what they look like, figuring out there's a lot of hype around models. There's also a lot of mystery because people don't know how they work. They just know it's kind of a black box. Or even if you're like kind of more interested in models for like science, just kind of theoretical models or whatever, those are also, you have to understand how the assumptions that go into them, how they work, how do you test a model. So there's a lot there, but we should kind of, I'm going to be in that headspace this fall, so we'll see where that goes. Then of course you have your interest in some of the things with psychiatry and some of the theories there, and we should definitely try to find people who are interested in that and get them down the road of like realizing something, of course.
Well, even you may remember vaguely, Anusha was one of the a couple of years ago did some stuff. She might want to do things in that space too. She has a lot of she has some experience there, so she's kind of been someone who kind of was like, hey, I might want to do this. So a number of people have been like, okay, well, this sounds cool. Like get to the place where you can share it and start doing it. So I think that will be a space where more happens. And I know we have like Morgan with the computational psychiatry stuff, but also like I know people want there to be somewhat project-based thing that they can contribute to,
Right.
and it's working to do that. So, but yeah, go on. Sorry.
Oh, well, yeah, and then so that would be great if we could build like a psychiatry group, or get something off the ground there, because we've been talking about that for a while. We of course been talking about some of the things that you and Jen have been doing, but I'd like to see this kind of move towards like the computational psychiatry paper that we mentioned a long time ago, or have some sort of presence in that area, whatever the
I
form
don't
that
even remember
takes.
what that paper is at this point.
Well, I don't think it's anywhere. It's just kind of a thing that we've discussed. But
Mm.
I mean, it's like, how do you get to a spot where you can like lay down a marker? Yeah, show people that you're doing something, or have something to contribute. I guess is more the
Mm.
thing. But yeah, and then of course the project management and lab management stuff, and administrative stuff, and that kind of bucket. So you know, uh, we have the discussions we've been having in the open source meetings. I think those have been really interesting. Especially yesterday, we talked about social capital and political capital, and how those things are part of managing projects. So if you want to manage a project, you have to have sort of the right organizational scheme, like people like Agile, uh, and there are a lot of drawbacks to Agile as well as advantages. But like people don't generally think about the social and political capital, or some of the things about some of the problems that they're trying to solve with those methods. So I think that's very useful to have those things grounded. And then, of course, building the infrastructure that we have sought.
Mm.
It's always a challenge to get your hands around, say, with the stuff we're doing. We're generating video and papers, and it just kind of gets subsumed, by time. So how do we get the themes out of those pieces of or those artifacts? So that's another thing, and I think that's not to be, I still don't think we have a good handle on how that would work, but it's always a challenge. So yeah, we have those three things, and I think finding people who are interested in those areas, or we can recruit people, or just kind of have discussions about it and see where that goes, or just try to produce artifacts like papers or talks or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Wednesday might be a good day for me as well for next week, because I know we're not gonna. Condition futures isn't going to be that next week anyway. It's going to be a general slot. I don't know if it's want to be that late or not, but we can talk more with that later.
Okay.
But Wednesday might be a good deal. One other thing, I think I will go physically to San Diego in the next month or two.
Okay.
I was going to try to do it this summer, but then I realized I think I'm going to try to do it basically more so during course time, and meet people, like do some meet some professors and some student things there, and that can be a little bit more like we could try to plan some specific things around that whenever that happens. I'm thinking kind of September right now, but sort of like I'd love to have sort of I don't know if I could do some like major joint UCSD ORL event, or like kind of like the tour of NICWIC, but do the campus there or something. But that's on the docket. But yeah, that's yeah. I don't have anything more to sort of overly share at that point. But I have a lot of things like I want to go. Just gonna go do them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess that's the fourth thing, is the NICWIC, or the Society Ethics and Tech stuff, which has been kind of on the back burner. Restarting that around maybe some.
Oh yeah.
Just going
yeah,
back and revisiting everything were kind of our themes that are the strongest, or most interesting.
I feel what's actually I guess I can give a bit of an update from NICWIC. So one of the things, it won't nobody here except Brian McCorkle, who for some reason I've been having like really interesting dreams lately, and I'm kind of like temporally displaced. The kind of is one of those moments where like you're in the time passages kind of bit, and I think Brian McCorkle was in my dream last night. So I remember differentiating him between somebody else, and I'm like, oh yeah, like you or Brian. So anyway, hi Brian. I occasionally see Brian on certain social media, and it's always good. Brian's a really cool guy. He's I think he's doing a bunch of music stuff lately. But outside of Brian McCorkle and I think Sam Carollo, who is an intern, Sam got a new job. Also, Sam's doing something. I saw her update on LinkedIn, and she has a new job. She was, somebody you always expect to. You just know she's going to do well, and I'm always excited to see where she goes. Sam's doing well, and Brian's doing well, and I'm mentioning them because they're both two people in the lab who we actually physically met at NICWIC before. And my news is the only people that we have any context for at all, outside of those who saw that one video, is the location for NICWIC is going to be different for the first time since I've ever joined them, which is basically 5 years ago. And we'll see where it's going to be, but it could be in Albany proper, which would be very interesting. And it wasn't far away from Albany before, but the fact that it might be in Albany or some other cities, it could be in a place called Poughkeepsie, which is sort of between Albany and New York City. We don't really know yet, but we're looking at. I'm for those that don't know, I'm a co-chair for the event for the last for basically the last 18 months or so. And we're in a stage of realizing, okay, well, we can't use our previous venue because it's just going to be unavailable during the normal time we do it, or we wanted to do it. And so we have a new venue, and that's cool for NICWIC. And also that can be an opportunity for people who want to help out. People want to get experience with conference logistics, or even setting up like this. Remember last time I kept saying, oh, we could maybe use moderators for XYZ. We will actually probably use them this year because people are actually more gung-ho. We have people that are a little more tech savvy and want to run a Discord server around the event, which I think is a great idea and something I've kind of been pushing for. But we needed a little bit more support to do it. So, we will have opportunities for helping out with the conference, helping out with the event when that comes up, which will be in April. But there's things leading up to, like we're about to put out a call for CFP, call for involvement, call for proposals, call for people to do research talks and first timers. And a great thing about NICWIC is that it's intentionally focused on giving people, in particular, women in computing, New York celebration of women in computing, but more so anybody who is new to doing events and doing things in the tech space, and so on. So it's great community around that. But that's happening specifically for NICWIC, and we'll be having a new venue, potentially in Albany and some other cities around the area. Now, if it's in Albany specifically, though, that'll be a very interesting dovetail between many of our other existing Albany connections. That said, beyond NICWIC, yes, the plan for me has been, I basically, NICWIC, or Society Ethics Tech as a group, has been on hiatus, or just I don't know, on a long vacation for most of this year. And I think that's been warranted, and I missed it, but it is ready to sort of come back, and I've given it a little more of a home. I'm building a working group. I'm basically trying to use like a structure called like working groups, and I'm like Cognition Futures is sort of the original first working group. Society of Tech was kind of the second one in like my thing that I've tried to develop. But giving it a little bit more structure, and then opening up to intentionally doing things like NICWIC or other stuff again, we'll be coming back. So it's like it's basically, I'm gonna say open season. That sounds a little strange, but it's coming. It's something that's no longer going to be just sort of in the archive status and now happening again. And I'm looking forward to that, both for like a submission to NICWIC, but also many other things that do tie into, I think, data ethics, that do tie into a lot of the. It is a really interesting time to be in that space, as always, like with what's happening administratively at these big organizations, and then the more frontline stuff too. So I'm looking forward to that a lot.
Yeah. What are the working group structure? What do those look like?
Well, I mean, that's basically in terms of JoPro, I'm just calling these groups working groups. And what I mean by that is it doesn't sound, it's basically everything we already know. It's just I'm formalizing them as JoPro working groups in the sense of when there are new things, and it's not so much me making them, I wanted to kind of make the structure a little bit more clear for people if they do emerge, like kind of around a topic, sort of like you could say, like, if we wanted to in the lab, like do like representational brains and phenotype as a working group, but like what I more so mean is something that has sort of a not trying to overly define the project space, but more ideally getting people into some of the specific roles, and then having like a space, even in a very simple space or a simple way, like cognition futures or the mental health working group will be things that have sort of a statement about what they're doing. Who are the people involved? Ideally, putting some, like, I'm trying to make the blog posts for that group all in one spot, and then the projects or some indication of the projects that have happened. It's not really anything fancy. It's just giving it a title and giving it some structure, and that's partly what I'm building to do with JoPro stuff. Is like where can these things sort of be housed? And I think I'm taking a lot of I'm taking a lot of inspiration from how the Media Lab presents what they're doing, the MIT Media Lab, and not even in a sense of there's some in de facto there isn't really anything different about the idea than what we try to do with like Cognition Futures or Society Ethics Tech. Maybe if we could, Cognition Futures has a standing meeting, which is, great, even though it's on hiatus. And maybe that'll happen with other groups too. But the very least, the idea of a working group is this sort of, they're a thing. They're an entity that's somewhat clearly defined, and what was I going to say about and trying to structure it in a way that's a little bit more intermediately tenable to someone. So when someone's coming by, they have something more to look at than. Well, I mean, I guess the older JoPro website wasn't so bad. Like, I've been trying to have this sort of like page around, this web page around Cognition Futures for a while, Society Ethics Tech for a while, and they exist, but kind of updating that and putting them in a more formal structure than what the previous JoPro website had, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like a lot of it's just for people coming by to see what it is, but realizing that that can be tied to like the infrastructural work that's very tedious for people trying to manage things. So it's a long-winded answer, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of like you have formalization, but you don't try to dictate what the bins are in terms of like what you're doing. You're exploring different things and kind of letting people do chart their own course.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the working groups are maybe a little bit more directed in their binning than what we have in the lab, but like it's it's not, you know, Joe Pro itself, it could do things like part of why I made Joe Pro is that if there are things that don't fit the structure of the lab, they can just be Joe Pro stuff. If there's things that we do want to do here, like Cognition Futures, like my vision of Joe Pro is more like Joe Pro isn't a, we're not, it's sort of, it's more of a facilitator or coordinator, kind of like, maybe kind of like INCF. Like I know INCF does things, but like, you know, for Google Summer of Code, INCF isn't like teaching the mentoring or holding the meetings for Google Summer of Code. You're doing that. And I feel like for the topical, for working groups, they're gonna be partner oriented. So like if there was something at, I don't know, this is kind of a stretch example, but like a plot twisters based, you know, educational technology working group with plot twisters as the sort of main partner for that thing, that could happen there. And it could be focused on that. And then, you know, left to be what it's about and doing it that way. Whereas, you know, Cognition Futures and Society Ethics Tech are kind of already structured into those groups. So yeah, it could be choose your own adventure, but it's a little more like clear, a little more clarity in its project focus or updates, ideally. And then, you know, they will only go as far as, you know, there are people that do them. So it's not, I don't have a sense of I am working on all of these things all the time. It's more I'm trying to offer some facilitation of things for when people do want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think, you know, usually even in Orel, we have like kind of generic stuff that isn't in a project. And then we have formal things that are in projects. So yeah, it's definitely things that aren't really related to a project yet, or things that aren't really related to a project. It's not a big enough chunk of things. Not a theme.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how that, you know, how you kind of built that structure, and yeah. So yeah, we should definitely talk about the, you know, how to set up some of these more immediate things, getting people in, the structure of it, because we've done this a couple times and we have materials on it, but you know, just to revisit those. So when we have our meeting, please have that ready to look at. Like, and I'm talking about
that may be something that Jen helps with.
Okay.
Because Jen, I don't think Jen, I'm very strong sense that Jen isn't going to become any kind of a like assistant lab manager or like administrative person that way.
Yeah.
But almost like much, but she definitely is and has been exactly sort of like as like curriculum and developmental consultant for like how to do that, and that's greatly appreciated. And I think her, as much as she's available to do stuff like that on those things, I will try to get her help. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And again, by the materials, I mean, we had some project descriptions a while back. I may have those actually, so I'll try to get those out.
Yeah, I remember like the cards and all that stuff. And I feel like one of the things, if I haven't totally pulled this off yet, but both, like, one of the things that I think Joe Pro, like, I would love there to be sort of a, sort of like a, I don't quite know what to call it, both for like working groups, which are much more like high level, bigger thing that could happen. And I have a few of them. I have a few sort of like working groups in my mind, also like demarcate certain zones of like activity, like cognition futures versus mental health working group. Cognition futures is much more to me theoretically oriented, and much more about bigger models, and much more about like understanding phenomenology, understanding like cognitive science. Mental health working group is a little more clinical, a little more on the ground, a little bit more what are people who are sort of doing these therapeutic or psychiatric or social work related things doing, and not as high in the sky, um, if you will. But like there are sort of spaces I'd really like to see things in, spaces I personally would want to do stuff in down the road. So there's that kind of bigger scale thing, and I want to offer, much essentially what the standing offer in the lab is like. If you want to start a project, you can do it, and like if you want something that's related to oro, like let's use what we're doing here and like facilitate that, almost like as in this case Joko as like a on ramp to doing things at Orel, and let's build a project structure in the lab around what you want to do. Like if you want to go heavy into Rayburn vehicle stuff, or maybe the embodied intelligence guy wants to do it in embodied intelligence here. But that kind of gets to outside of working groups. Like I would love there to be sort of this almost like gallery of potential projects that are kind of like the cards. There's a Chris, there's a description, just things people can do, like in the context of the lab. Like, okay, like we have this cybernetic stuff that's happening with a reading group too. We have cognition futures. We have almost like this project management discussion. We have the model building stuff, and it's sort of like at the very least something kind of all in one spot where people could just see, oh, what's all these like cards, almost like it's like laying out cards on the table. I want to pick one up and look at it. Like getting that ready in the next month or two, I think would be really interesting, and what we can do. So anyway, I'm often like project planning land, so we can talk about other things. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Yeah, well, I think it was a great discussion, just in terms of kind of getting it back into the forefront of our discussions and what we might do. And yeah, I'll think about that more, about like how we might present it to the world, and so that's always good. Hello, Morgan. How are you?
Good. Still just gathering myself in this morning.
Okay.
But listening, thanks.
Oh, welcome. So yeah, this week we had a couple of meetings. We had our DevaWorm meeting, of course, and we talked a little bit about the GSOC projects, but mostly about some different topics in biology. We talked about morphogenesis. We talked about the development of shape and limb development and some of those things. And it's kind of an interesting discussion. And then we talked a little bit about Artificial Life 2024, the conference, which is what just ended. It was being held in Copenhagen. We kind of went over the website, went through some of the keynotes and things like that. So definitely a lot of interesting stuff at that conference. Interesting discussion about morphogenesis and limb bud dynamics, and then some GSOC related things, project related things. And then on Friday we had our open source meeting where we talked more about projects. We had updates from two of our students, one doing things with graph neural networks, the other doing things with large language models. And and then we talked about, I had a discussion at the end about how people use LLMs in their workflow, and then also some things on the sign-in approach to kind of formulating problems with respect to the project that you're trying to manage. And then we had a further discussion about that. and this other discussion about social and political capital and project management. So a lot of interesting threads there we need to kind of pull together at some point. But so we haven't had our cybernetics meeting yet. We had tried to have this 2 weeks ago, but of course then we had our neuromatch mentorship sessions that kind of intervened. So we haven't had that yet since I think June or something like that. So it's been a while, but we're going to revisit that soon enough, and we'll get the ball rolling on that. And then of course Cognition Futures, which has been on hiatus over the summer, and we'll kind of come back to that. So definitely looking forward to all those things. Okay, so we have a lot of things in the Slack that kind of come up. This is one of those things. This is a paper, and we have a lot of channels. One of the channels we have is Data Science ML. So I believe this was either in Data Science ML or in Math. It was cross-posted. This is an interesting paper it's called Beyond Euclid, an illustrated guide to modern machine learning with geometric, topological, and algebraic structures. And so we've been interested in this both in the sort of the lab proper and in DevoWorm in a number of ways. So in DevoWorm, we've done some work on category theory and development. We've done contextual geometric structures here in the lab, which are these topological structures, geometric structures that describe different behavioral and cultural spaces. And then, of course, we're doing things with developmental graph neural networks. Part of that involves topological data analysis. And then, of course, we've done things with complex networks, which have this sort of geometric and topological structure. So there are a lot of themes in the lab that kind of are organized around these things. And so this paper kind of talks about modern machine learning with these different types of structures. And, this is, of course, sort of a theory paper, but also a very practical grounding of some of these concepts in machine learning, as it were. So our interest is not just in machine learning, of course, but in modeling systems. So, this is an interesting approach that kind of situates these sorts of approaches and how they're being used in machine learning. So the abstract reads, the enduring legacy of Euclidean geometry underpins classical machine learning, which for decades has primarily been developed for data lying in Euclidean spaces. So, we'll have, for example, a bunch of data points embedded in a Euclidean space. So, we think about a bivariate graph, which is usually, the type of thing where you have, say, like, it's a type of thing where you'll have an x-axis and a y-axis, and we have data points in that x and y space, and we have points, and then we have to figure out their relationship. And it's Euclidean in the sense that if we want to find a distance between 2 points, we usually take the slope, which is something like this. So we can calculate this distance here as sort of the Euclidean distance. So there are a number of ways we can calculate the Euclidean distance. And then, of course, when we orient ourselves across this point cloud, we usually draw, like, say, a trend line, or we draw some sort of, trend line, or we draw, like, a boundary around it. And that can be all described in terms of Euclidean geometry. So that's what we mean by Euclidean space. And this has sort of been the norm. And of course, we can do things like build higher level or higher dimensional representations, like 3-dimensional spaces. And this is where we have a 3-dimensional point cloud. And the 3-dimensional point cloud, of course, can also be described in a Euclidean sense, where we have x, y, z. We have a triplet that can describe then the shape of the data. And there are a lot of interesting things you can do with the shape. There's, of course, topological data analysis, but there's also like, you can derive networks from this. And you can have those networks be, Euclidean in terms of their orientation and their nature. Now, it's good. It's a very powerful set of techniques, and representing in the space kind of gives us this power of sort of using the tools that we have of distance and trends and summarizing shapes. But there are more types of spaces that you can use. You can embed things in higher dimensional spaces, which are hard to visualize, and you end up in some of these spaces where you have things that are very abstract, and then you map that back down to Euclidean space, and you get things like UMAP visualizations, or you get different types of dimensionality reduction visualizations as well, and they're represented in these Euclidean spaces where it's kind of a wonky mapping of so like this might be a UMAP visualization. You see these all the time in like next gen sequencing papers where they have to characterize the shape of the data. So this is like maybe like a UMAP visualization. And again, you're just taking these data at higher dimensions, you're reducing it down to 2 dimensions. There might be 2 UMAP dimensions that you're interested in. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about with respect to Euclidean spaces. You can also map your Euclidean data, or at least like your point cloud, your dimensional point cloud. So you can take the 3-dimensional point cloud and you can map it to something else, some other type of space. So from Euclidean space to like a hyperbolic space. So this point cloud then can be, each point can be the distance between the points can be re-represented in this curved space, so the positive curvature, and that's usually, or a negative curvature, and that's usually with a hyperbolic space. And that's good, say, for modeling an embryo point cloud, because the embryo, of course, you can take, Euclidean distances, but you can also take hyperbolic distances. And that's sometimes a better representation of the data because a lot of things happen in this curved space. So you can go from Euclidean to hyperbolic. And of course, this requires, a different set of statistics. So that's kind of an aside to like why we're interested in these kinds of, spaces and these kinds of mappings between spaces. So, we have a lot of powerful techniques for Euclidean spaces. They're very simple to sort of represent data and at these kind of distances. And this has, been very powerful for modern machine learning. Yet modern machine learning increasingly encounters ritually structured data that is inherently non-Euclidean. These data can exhibit intricate geometric, topological, and algebraic structure. We saw this with respect to our UMAP representations, which are these high-dimensional spaces that have been reduced. So, we can do this on a Euclidean space, but we can also use a different kind of space. Maybe not hyperbolic, maybe there's some other space we can use. There are a number of options here, but the point being is that the Euclidean is sort of the basic type of space, metric space, and then hyperbolic is maybe a curved metric space. And you can have other types of metric spaces that are more complex. Now, in machine learning, we often have data that have this intricate geometric, topological, and algebraic structure from the geometry of the curvature of space-time, which, of course, is famously these different types of spaces with a positive curvature, to other types of data like topologically complex interactions between neurons in the brain, to the algebraic transformations describing symmetries of physical systems. And of course, I just talked about the embryo, how we might use sort of a hyperbolic space for that. Extracting knowledge from such non-Euclidean data necessitates a broader mathematical perspective. So you need to be able to think in a non-Euclidean fashion, and how, and it's hard to do because those Euclidean spaces are very intuitive. We're very used to that, and it's in fact kind of the way we think about navigating space. When we walk around a city, we often have these kind of, this sort of Euclidean grid in our minds, or this Euclidean space where the distances are sort of, straight line, and we can, or there's the street is curved, but it's a straight line. You typically don't think about like the curvature of the earth when you're navigating somewhere. You think about a flat map. So if we, lived in a world, well, we do live in a world that's non-Euclidean in that sense, but we often don't think about the curvature of the earth when we're planning a trip across country. So it's somewhat counterintuitive, at least to what we think about in terms of our own navigation, although it's there. It's always underlying the actual data of the world. So extracting knowledge from such non-Euclidean data necessitates a broader mathematical perspective, echoing a 19th century revolution that gave rise to non-Euclidean geometry. An emerging line of research is redefining modern machine learning with non-Euclidean structures. And so now we're using non-Euclidean structures in modern machine learning. This is, of course, something that we use in topological data analysis, but getting it to work in a machine learning context is really the challenge here. So the goal here is to generalize classical methods to unconventional data types with geometry, topology, and algebra. So we have these tools in mathematics. We have also different types of spaces that we can use. And we can map things from a Euclidean space to these other types of spaces and back again. And machine learning techniques are based on sort of Euclidean spaces or Euclidean assumptions, and we want to take non-Euclidean assumptions and include them in these models. So in this review, we provide an accessible gateway to this fast-growing field and propose a graphical taxonomy that integrates recent advances into an intuitive unified framework. We subsequently extract insights into current challenges and highlight exciting opportunities for future development in the field. So this is good. This is a nice, looks like a nice paper. And it talks about sort of the origins of the Euclidean view, which goes back to Euclid, and the elements of geometry. And so this is sort of our basic understanding of space and shape, how we analyze space and shape at the very basic level. And so, the Euclidean view is characterized by flat planes and straight lines, and this remained unquestioned until the 19th century. Only then did mathematicians venture beyond to develop the principles of non-Euclidean geometry on curved spaces. Their pioneering work revealed that there is no singular true geometry. And, this is where you get this, we think about space-time, which was being developed in the very early 20th century, and, thinking about how that is curved. And of course, we understood, sort of coordinate systems on the surface of the Earth, but, kind of working with those coordinate systems as a curved space, that was something that was kind of emerging at that time too. So, it's something that's critical to the operation of satellites and things like that. So this is definitely kind of coming into its own during the 20th century. And so, there are a lot of examples we could use. They use neurons and like space-time, but there are other examples as well. The non-Euclidean revolution was part of a greater trend towards generalization and abstraction in mathematics. In addition to expanding the realm of geometry, mathematicians proceeded to define more abstract notions of space, freed from rigid geometric concepts like distances and angles. So if you notice something about our Euclidean spaces, we have two types of like kind of, sort of fundamental things here. We of course have our distances. So for any 2 points, we have a distance between them. And this distance is represented maybe by d, and we can have a set of distances represented by di. So we have di is inclusive, and d, which is like going to be like our set of distances. So we have our distances, and those can be characterized by a metric. So that would be like d would equal, like the difference between y and x on a two-dimensional plane. So we might have like this. Look at the slope of the position between y and x, or x and y, and we can end up with this number. So we have a number which is usually maybe like 2.4. Okay, and then all of the distances are uniform. We know that maybe what they're talking about is like a fundamentally different way where the actual reference frame for this is curved. So when you have a curved reference frame, it's kind of like the surface of the Earth, where you have these are this is our latitude and longitude on the surface of a globe, and we have two spots here. And when we use a flat map, we usually calculate a distance that's kind of straight line, but in fact that distance is curved. So the distance between these 2 points is curved, and this is also a distance, but it's not the same type of like distance that you would see here. This is actually kind of in a straight line, embedded in a straight line coordinate system. So our distances are, pretty easy to calculate. We need to have a better mathematics. First, we need to use a different set of tools to calculate the distance on a sphere. And so that's kind of what they're getting at with this. The other is that you have angles. And of course, our angles, or angular measurements, are quite important for sort of this coordinate system. So if we have these 2 points D here, or we have our distances here, then we have our 2 points. So let's take this and this, let's define this as x, this is y, and this is z. And we have our distance between x and z, which is xz, and we have xy. And then we have this angle. So this angle is an angle between the two, and we might represent the angle with a1, which is this sort of the I guess you could call it a vector space, or so you have this a1, which is the sort of the angle between these two distances and how they diverge. So this might be interesting for a number of things. And of course, we have in machine learning, we have descriptions of the angle between two vectors. And so this is where we have a1, which is the angle. And that's an important thing because you want to know kind of the origin point and how things diverge from that origin point. Or you want to know how two lines intersect and what the effect is on that intersection. So there are a number of applications using angle. But now in this kind of a situation where you have a globe, the globe is actually going to have, angles are going to have to be treated a little bit differently. I mean, you still have angles, but they're different on the surface. So that's what they're getting at. You need to have a whole new set of tools, basically, to look at these higher kind of these higher level spaces or more specialized types of space. This gave rise to the field of topology, which examines the properties of a space that are preserved under continuous transformation, such as stretching and bending. And of course, this is important in developmental biology. We talk about this in DevoWorm with some of the things with morphogenesis. So you have like basic models of morphogenesis, which are about differentiation and morphogen gradients and sort of the way that those things form patterns. But then, of course, you have the soft materials aspect of morphogenesis, which is where you, not only get a bunch of cells that behave like different types of materials. So sometimes they behave like a fluid, sometimes they behave like a solid, and you have these jamming transitions that describe those different, the differences between those phases of collective behavior of the material. But you also have these stretching and bending dynamics. So, like a bunch of cells will form a tissue. That tissue can behave like a solid, it can behave like a liquid, depending on what stage of development it's in, or its configuration in the embryo. But you also have to have this compliant behavior of the material. So it has to be able to stretch and bend without dissolving. And so, we talk in DevoWorm, we talk often about the mechanics and the physics of that process. But there's this need to represent these kind of transformations mathematically. And so you have to do this with topology. You have to use a different kind of mathematical description. You can't really describe those sorts of bending and stretching dynamics with the Euclidean space. So this is where they kind of talk about basically why you would want to use this. And of course, you have these toy models such as the donut and coffee mug, which are topologically equivalent, since one can be continuously deformed into the other. So, we think of a donut and a coffee mug as two very different things, but topologically they're the same thing. And so, that sort of equivalence is important to understanding those objects and how they're, characterized, how they're represented, but also, how they might be categorized in different ways, other than like the typical sort of feature space that we're used to in machine learning. So yeah, and then now this revolution is unfolding in machine learning. So they're starting to build models that incorporate these aspects. So in the last 2 decades, a burgeoning body of research has expanded the horizons of machine learning, moving beyond the flat Euclidean spaces to embrace the rich variety of structures offered in non-Euclidean geometry, topology, and abstract algebra. So this is where, we're doing things like geometric statistics, and there's some citations here from 2006 and 2023. There are different types of deep learning approaches, so geometric deep learning, topological deep learning, and equivariant deep learning, which is, of course, these citations here, and these are from the 2020s. And so there are all sorts of different, so equivariant deep learning and topological deep learning are very important in graph neural networks. Geometric deep learning also, but not as, this has applications in other areas as well. In the 20th century, non-Euclidean geometry radically transformed how we model the world with pen and paper. In the 21st century, this will work with machines. So our machines need to have these representations. So I talk a little bit about geometry and algebra and the differences between them. In machine learning, data can possess explicit spatial structure, such as an image of a brain scan or a rendering of a protein surface. So this is where we have these models where we have like a protein structure or a brain scan which has a spatiality to it that we want to capture. And of course, like I showed you with something like this, where we have a point cloud, we might want to capture the shape of a sphere. We can use an Euclidean embedding or a hyperbolic embedding. But we also have these types of things where there's not an inherent spatiality, like a UMAP visualization. This is of gene expression, which means that we don't really have a native space to it. It doesn't have a native spatiality, but we can represent it with a native spatiality, or at least a spatiality that we can map to a visualization. So that's a difference there. Even when the data is not overtly spatial, a data set can be naturally conceptualized as a set of samples drawn from an abstract surface embedded in a high-dimensional space. So we want to build these abstract surfaces when one embedded in a high-dimensional space. We sometimes want to make that a lower-dimensional space and represent it on a 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional surface. Sometimes we just want to know that abstract surface and what it looks like in terms of some sort of description. Because understanding the shape of data, that is, the shape of the space to which this data belongs, can give important insights into the patterns of relationships that give data its meaning. So we want to understand the shape. We don't want to reduce it down to something that is easy to visualize or to reduce it down to a Euclidean space. We want to just let the data speak about its own space. What is its native space? What are the spatial relationships that are interesting? What are just the structural relationships? Putting aside spatial relationships, what are the structural relationships that are interesting? how do things have a distance? How do things have angles that can be represented in not just Euclidean space, but other spaces as well? So, we have to think about topology, geometry, and algebra. So they kind of give you this table here where they talk about the topological, the geometric, and the algebraic properties, and the sort of things that we have to think about. So, like I said, on the whiteboard, we have our geometric principles, we have distances, we have angles, and we have, of course, the measurements of those distances and angles. So we saw those measurements. Now, for topological representations, which are different than geometric representations, we have things like connectedness and continuity. If we think about graph theory, for example, we often think about connectedness, and we think about continuity. If we think about the example of the coffee mug and the donut, those two things look very different, but because there's a hole in the coffee mug around the handle, and there's a hole in the donut in the middle, we can think of those in terms of having a common connectedness. So those shapes, those topologies have a common connectedness. There's also a common continuity. Do you have a hole or do you not have a hole, and how are those things there? So we're interested in relationships there. We're interested in the, sort of the common relationships in that way. And of course, that affects our feature space, because in geometry, we have a feature space where we might have angles, we might have distances, we have those features on a surface where we might have like clusters or things like that. But in something like topology, we'll have a structure. So we have our coffee mug and we have our coffee mug, which is here. And we have our donut. These two things share the sort of interstitial space. They also have a curvature about them. And you can describe those things, you can describe those as having common features. So, we're interested maybe in not just these spatial relationships, but structural relationships. So these are common structural relationships. And so we would think of this as having sort of a common set of features. And so actually this is important in terms of embryos, because embryos will look kind of similar. You might have like a Drosophila embryo that has like striping, and a zebrafish embryo that has like, you start to get the formation of this tadpole that's going to come out of this set of cells. And so, there are different transformations that occur in development. But, you can't really describe it in terms of distances between cells, because in Drosophila you have the cellularization phase where things go from the solid to these cells. And then in zebrafish you have this transformation where you go from a bunch of cells to this this fundamentally different structure. So, these are important. This is maybe an important way to characterize these different types of systems. And then, of course, we have algebraic properties, which is symmetry and invariance. And so in algebraic properties, we, of course, don't worry about distances and angles. We worry about symmetry, or, the left-right pairing of things, or the different fold pairing of things. And that's very important in, say, embryos. And then invariance, which is, what are the things that are kind of common to all things. And then that's, of course, a set of transformations. So we're interested in these different aspects of the data. So this has a lot of use in machine learning, a lot of use in analyzing systems in general. So we provide an accessible and concise introduction to the essential mathematical concepts. For readability, we define the concepts primarily linguistically here, and we refer to the reader to the works of Bronstein, 2021, Cohen 2021, Gigi 2023, Gigi 2023 for their precise mathematical definitions. So this is, kind of guiding us to some of these topical sort of deep dives. Bronstein, of course, is a big name in graph neural networks, and some of these other people, of course, have done a lot of work in this area. And this is all very recent. These are all very recent references, so this is an emerging area. Okay, so given the generality of topological structures, topological spaces can be quite exotic, as we've just kind of discussed. They're not the same as sort of that Euclidean, these Euclidean assumptions we often make of in machine learning. Within this paper, we do not consider continuous topological spaces, and we explicitly restrict the term topology to discrete topological structures, such as graphs, cellular complexes, and hypergraphs. And so these are the kinds of structures. So we've been having this discussion in DevaWorm about graphs and hypergraphs. And so, we have, of course, graphs which have this sort of, it's interesting because you could represent a graph topology as a Euclidean topology. So if we have our graphs, we go back to just draw a simple graph where we have nodes and we have edges, and we draw lines between them. And that's the only, it looks like a Euclidean structure, it's fine. But then, of course, we want to know things like, we maybe want to know the distance between nodes. We want to know that. But we might also want to know the connectedness of this structure. So we might want to look at path length from edge to edge. Or we might want to look at other attributes. So if this graph has some depth to it, as you can see, it kind of has this depth to the structure. But we also have its width and a height. And this is assuming the graph is embedded in a spatial set of relationships. So we might actually not care about those spatial relationships. This might just be an abstract graph. Might be a representation of different values in a number line. So there's no spatiality to this graph. It's just kind of there, and we're just drawing lines. Maybe like a commonality or distance metric, and then graphing it out like this. So this is not explicitly a Euclidean representation. This has topological aspects to it. Now in a hypergraph, you have these nodes that are sort of hypernodes, and then within it you have individual nodes. And so this is something we're doing in DevaWorm. We're doing hypergraphs of embryos, where we have these hypernodes, and then we have edges between these nodes here, and there, so they're kind of grouped into these hypernodes. These nodes are kind of all connected together, and then so you have these hypernodes, you have the nodes, and so then you end up with these hyper edges, which are these sort of bundles of edges that go from node to node. So there's this, now we have this sort of, you could describe this in a Euclidean fashion, but it's really more of a higher level description that we can use to get the most out of this representation. So that's kind of the difference between these kinds of structures that are maybe look at first pass to be Euclidean, but they also have a lot of other topological properties. So there are a lot of things, we have manifolds, which are geometric measurements. A manifold is a continuous space that locally resembles or is homeomorphic to Euclidean spaces in the neighborhood of every point. In other words, it is locally linear and does not intersect itself. Locally, it resembles a flat space. Its global shape may exhibit curvature. With that additional structure, the manifold can be seen as a soft and elastic surface. So the manifold is like this sort of space, this surface that describes all of the data. And it can have many different types of shapes to it. It's not this sort of two-dimensional space or three-dimensional space, and we find that the Euclidean representations, we have this sort of curved surface, and it just follows where the data points are. So it doesn't try to force the data into this two or three-dimensional space, so we don't have to do things like data reduction. We have this space that just describes every data point, and that's the manifold. And then we can visualize the manifold, but we don't make any a priori assumptions about the space itself. So a manifold might, have a very complex surface, and, we don't, maybe even discontinuous, I guess. So it might be something like this. And, the manifold has a lot of relationships with dynamical systems theory. Oftentimes in dynamical systems theory, you have a phase space you want to describe. And that phase space is not, it's where the dynamics are. So these points are on a manifold. We might use these points to, have like a phase space, or we can then, analyze the trajectory of the system. So this is a manifold, and it makes new assumptions about sort of the metric space. It's just kind of like all the points. Yeah. And so actually we talked about homeomorphism, which is of course important in cybernetics, because the good regulator can be described as a homeomorphism of a real system. So in the good regulator, we just finished a paper on this. We have our system and we have our model, which is the regulator, and there's this mapping between the two. And the regulator is a homeomorphism of the system. So if the system is described as a manifold, then the regulator also has to map every point in this manifold to some space that the model has. So for example, if the regulator is a bivariate system, and it might be Euclidean, it has to take this manifold and it has to map it to this Euclidean space. And so sometimes a regulator, you can't do that. You have to approximate it. So you have this mapping from non-Euclidean to Euclidean. And, we talk about good regulation. And the problem here is that we have to have a model or a regulator that maps sort of the topological complexity of the system. If we can describe a system with a manifold, and we map it to a Euclidean system or a bivariate Euclidean representation, then we lose information. In this mapping, the non-Euclidean to Euclidean mapping, we lose information, we lose the capacity to regulate that system. So we lose a lot of that capacity. And it's a problem because, and of course we talk about like a model of the system having to be sort of almost as good as the system itself, or things like that. This is a limitation of course, models with respect to the system. So if a model is, doesn't have the same information as the system itself, then it, isn't able to regulate that system as well. So, we have, of course, models in our head, mental models, representations, and we act upon them. And of course, the real world is a system with a lot of complexity. And our mental models or our representations kind of deal with that by sort of, paring down that complexity and modeling it as maybe more of a Euclidean space. That means, of course, we can do just basically, good enough operations on the system, on this manifold, but we don't have the capacity to be perfect. We don't have that perfect mapping. So I think that's an important point. And that's, with respect to cybernetics and the good regulator theorem. But it's an important point in machine learning too, because our models in machine learning are trying to basically capture everything in a system. And that homeomorphic mapping is a critical concept. This is not something, we kind of touched on it in the paper where, we're talking about like how machine learning models are kind of dealing with the real world, and you're trying to build a world model as this regulator. So this regulator is acting as a world model to the system, but there are limitations, of course, in how much the regulator can be a world model. So So then, they get into a lot of different manifolds and metrics. So, the Riemannian manifold is the thing we often use in space-time to represent this positive curvature. This leads us to a Riemannian metric, which of course is like the metric on a globe, where you have a distance between 2 points, but it's curved and it has its own sort of rules for deriving the distance. You also have, of course, geodesics, which are on the curved manifold or Euclidean sort of version of straight line distances on a curved manifold. And so, yeah, there are different ways you can represent distances in these spaces. And then they talk about the structure of data. So, we have our data points and we're putting it into a model. And the first thing we really want to know is, what is the structure of the data? Is our data structure rich or structure poor? So sometimes our data is really structure rich. Sometimes it's very, say, highly organized and we're in luck. Sometimes it's very hard to characterize the structure of the data. And that's when we have problems, of course, in terms of accuracy and classification accuracy and other things, and learning from examples. Sometimes we need a lot of examples. Sometimes our examples are out of distribution and we can't really learn very effectively from them. So this is all sort of, plays into this as well. When the structure is Euclidean, it's easy to find the structure in the data. When the structure is, say, geometric or topological, or we need to think about those things to kind of get at the structure, it's a little bit harder. So we generally encounter two types of data. Either data as coordinates in space. So this is where we have positions of an object in 2D space, or data as signals over a space. So for example, an image is an image that has this sort of color signal, which is red, green, blue, and we have a three-dimensional representation of that signal. So every image has a set of colors, it has a set of red, green, blue values of each pixel. That's a three-dimensional signal. And we can plot that out in Euclidean space, or maybe in a 2D space. That space can be Euclidean, which is, interesting. It maybe yields us some sort of point cloud, and that's, we have to interpret that. So we might have a point cloud of RGB values. Or we might look at something like a topological model, where we look at the commonalities, or we might have this sort of homeomorphic mapping, where we take it and we build a model of the color values and what they represent. And, so that gives us different types of information that we can use. And so this is an example here of thinking beyond Euclid. This is a Euclidean space. The way they represent this is a sort of a square, Euclidean distance between nodes in this network. You have this Euclidean space, but if you add topology, you end up with like graph topologies, cellular complexes, which are these simplices, where, and I think we talked about this last week, where you have these shapes that you can describe in a graph network, hypergraphs, where you have nodes within hypernodes, and those hypernodes are connected. And then you have a more general representation, which is a combination of, say, like cellular complexes and hypergraphs. So this is where you have these sort of topological structures being derived from this very simple graph topology, or in this case, it's just a lattice that's connected. This is Euclidean space without nodes. It's just a coordinate system. And you can do this again with a simple lattice, where you define the coordinates at right angles on a two-dimensional surface. But then, of course, if we add geometry, we end up with spheres and spherical coordinate systems. We end up with this kind of hyperbolic space where there's this negative curvature aspect, and you have, those kinds of coordinate systems. You have toruses, which have a hole in the middle, so you have this sort of, this coordinate system that's discontinuous. And then you have a general where you have things like different types of tori that are deformed. And so there are different types of shapes. You could have a torus that's hyperbolic in nature, and that adds complexity. Then you have Euclidean distances or Euclidean space where you're calculating a distance between 2 points. And of course, you're adding algebra into that. So now when you add algebra into that, you can have translation. So you can have two points with a distance, and then you can translate the distance to another set of points or in a different orientation. So you can have translation, you can move things over in a coordinate space. You can have rotation where you think about the angle and transformations with respect to the angle. You can have reflection where you can reverse those vectors that result from the distance. And you can also have translation and rotation, so you can kind of shift the coordinate system, but also rotate the origin point or the destination point and change the direction of your vector. And you can think about all these things in terms of this common distance metric, where you're just kind of transforming the distance in different ways and learning things about the data. So yeah, they have a lot of interesting points here, these cards. So card C1 is just a point in Euclidean space. And this is, we think about like our canonical training sets. So if we think about the iris data set, which is a set of iris flowers, and they're just a lot of different instances of that iris. And, we think about the differences between them. We can actually represent those with a Euclidean space quite effectively. And that's fine, but we want to go beyond that. So we have our points in Euclidean space, and we have our points on a manifold. And the manifold is something like a spherical representation where a data point can be, on any point in this spherical representation. So we might have the geographic coordinates of a storm event or an object, different objects on the surface, different points on the surface of the Earth. Card C3 is point in topological space. So we have our topological space omega. Each point in that topological space corresponds to a node in a graph. So we might be interested in the graph of a social network where we can represent distances between the edges, but we can't just simply assume that those are Euclidean. We might need to embed that in the topological space. Then we have these, of course, different kinds of modifications. So we have points in Euclidean space that are equipped with group actions. So this is where we have data points in Euclidean space that have been equipped with the group action. So group actions enable us to model and preserve symmetries in the data. So this is like what we were talking about here with these kinds of algebraic transformations. We can do things like preserve symmetry, but also kind of represent the problem in different ways. So group actions enable us to model and preserve symmetries. A group action on the flower dimensions in our iris data set could be the change of units from centimeters to millimeters. So we want to understand our iris data set in different ways with different types of coordinate systems, or like we do with synthetic data or data augmentation, we might want to translate and transform those iris images, kind of, skew them in different ways or rotate them so that the model can learn, what these flowers, sort of the higher level structure of these flowers. So this is something that we might do in like different modes of machine learning where we want to really kind of generalize with the learning. C5 is point and manifold equipped with group action. So this is where there's a notion of group action to a manifold. So an example of this is a change in coordinate systems on the sphere, changing the origin of longitudes. So you're changing where the longitude and latitude positions are. So, this is where we can make rotations on a sphere. So we might think about a storm that happens at the same geographic location in the real world, and we might think about this across different spherical representations. So we want to be able to preserve the information content, but have different representations of those events. Card C6 is points in topological space equipped with group actions. And this is where we might have a graph of people equipped with an action that can change the way indexing is done on the data set. So the order in which we index people does not change their social relationships, only the way we represent this data in the computer. So this is where we might do permutations on our data, and we have to kind of think about how we can do that in topological space. So those are our 6 kind of points here, and they kind of give examples of these kind of how our higher level representations or topological representations or algebraic representations or geometric representations are useful to machine learning. So, you have a new person here, Trevor. Hello. And Jesse is coming in.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. Just sorry I was late, but I just wanted to check things out.
Oh, great. Would you like to introduce yourself, or?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I can turn my video on.
Okay.
Let me see. So I am studying right now. I'm trying to get into medical school. I'm a little bit older of a candidate, but I'm very interested in neuroscience related things and just checking things out. So yeah, just nothing super fancy. My background, I have a computational background, and so I studied bioengineering. That's what my master's is in. My undergrad, I made my own degree. I called it applied science, but so yeah, I all this mathematical stuff. I have like linear algebra, differential equations, but some of this stuff's a little bit over my head. But I'm trying to keep up. So
okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for attending, and of course we do a very broad variety of things here. So we do a lot of, we do mathematical stuff. We also do biological stuff, and so it kind of switches back and forth. So, yeah. And I assume you know Morgan, or you met Morgan.
I don't know. Actually, I was looking on your website, and I saw the link to this, and just thought I would check it out. So I don't know anybody. Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Welcome. Welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Morgan is
yeah. Sorry. I'm driving, so I pulled over. That's just to be clear. Yeah, love to know, what got you interested, and what kind of things you might be interested in talking about. I love the name applied science.
I tried to call it general engineering, but the College of Engineering didn't like that, so we ended up with applied science.
Applied science is great. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm a little. Oh, sorry. Please speak. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, did you, have a thesis topic, or, is there particular things that you're still kind of working on the side and things like that?
For sure. Yeah. So I basically I spent a while doing a drug target discovery thing, totally unrelated to neuroscience. So I scanned the proteome and found the drug target for inflammatory bowel disease that one could use for small molecule development. I have a bunch of wacky ideas here and there. But I feel like I don't want to waste everyone's time today talking about them. But
That's cool.
I'm just a little bit isolated, and so I haven't been in the academic world for a while, and so that's why I was really excited to stumble across an online public environment like this that just can give me a little more taste of something intellectual that I get exposed to.
Well, that's good. Yeah, that's kind of what we do.
It's what attracted me too. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not super familiar. Can you give me a little of your background, Morgan?
So I do psychiatric neuroimaging. So it's mostly MRI, computational analysis, MRI data. But I also, had a kind of, pre-meds, neuroscience, experimental psych background.
Very cool.
So yeah, welcome again, and yeah, so we do a lot of different things in the meetings, and we explore a lot of different things. So we were having a conversation earlier about like our administrative stuff, or like getting people involved in different projects. So that's something that is kind of we go from like different types of administrative stuff to topics that are wide ranging. So if don't feel intimidated. It's just kind of like some of these things you just have to like let wash over you, I guess is the way to think about it.
For sure, yeah. I'd love to hear more about that, but perhaps later. I feel bad interrupting your lecture.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I actually finished with that paper, so I don't know if Morgan had any thoughts about it. I know we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I love the geometry of statistics. Like that. Yeah, I've always found it a fascinating area, and I know that my own attempts learning linear algebra, it helped me to think about it geometrically. So yeah. But which? Sorry, I am driving. So which paper were you covering?
Okay, so
you weren't covering the paper by that Christian is on. Is it that one or?
Let's see. So let's go back up to the title. This is Christian Shoemake.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So this is the recent one that they published. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the one that was in one of the channels, and yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say published. They dropped it in bioRxiv.
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
arXiv. Yeah.
That seems to be the standard in machine learning is to get But yeah. So yeah, we've been kind of nibbling around the edges of graph neural networks and DevoWorm, and we've kind of been talking a little bit about some of these topics here in the group. And so, I mean, I'm really interested to see like where some of this leads. Like we kind of have this, the machine learning typical standard model, which is like, you put data in and you build a model that's sort of opaque, and this doesn't help, I guess, because it's really kind of hard to really get your head around what's going on. But we think about it as kind of magic, and so it'd be interesting.
The NeuroTech-X are the Moab mother of all BCI benchmarks. The same group that developed that, because the kind of the PI for it is in France, and the kind of PhD group that they all came out of is totally focused on this Riemannian geometry for classification. Yeah. And so what's the there's a Python toolbox that they develop that I think Alex Grenfell recently took over. What's it called? I'm blanking on its name right now, but yeah, I mean, this is it really, and the Moab paper shows, and as well as like some previous papers from that same group, like this Riemannian kind of approach, or kind of including the geometry improves the classification performance, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So I mean, it really does have practical benefits, and the and yeah, like the reason that we haven't heard from Christian in a while is that like he and I wouldn't be surprised if some of those other people have a startup here, of course, in San Francisco, as you do. But yeah. So it's good. Yeah, I'll definitely catch the videos for some more of that because
Yeah, you have to go over it a couple times and I'll post the link to the paper as usual. So I mean, as an aside, I had a question about like what you just said. Like, someone was asking me, if you go into like industry versus academia, what are the expectations? Like after you go to graduate school, and we're doing this mentorship discussion. So I was saying basically that in industry, you're not publishing as many papers. You don't have that kind of freedom necessarily, because you're kind of constrained by like doing more practical things, or you can't say certain things about what you're doing, or so yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think it's important to get across to people that like there's still, you're still on a perhaps unrealistic schedule. It's not to say, so your output isn't necessarily paper, but it's product. Or it's a contribution to a product, and 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 those deadlines aren't necessarily based on your choosing, or based on where you are with your understanding of the topic at the time, depending on how math oriented we're talking about here,
right.
Like so it's yeah, I had a similar thing, so at our open house for the community biolab, a bunch of neuroscience, Elliot introduced me as like Neurotech X representative, as well as the person working on organoids. And so a lot of the neuroscientists came up and were asking, I think I mentioned this at the GSOC meeting, the neuroscientists coming up and saying, how can I, what are the industry positions which, where I can use my neuroscience background, right? And that was a kind of difficult conversation because it's like I don't know how many neuroscience jobs there are, but I think any PhD is obviously is a great candidate to be a data scientist.
Right.
It's like, especially people who had a very data analysis focused neuroscience PhD, right? They probably had to learn a lot of software engineering, a lot of telling a story with data, a lot of obviously a lot of the math and statistics, potentially machine learning. What were the mentees asking about in your case?
Well, a lot of the things you just mentioned, like they were just very interested.
Okay, I mean, they weren't like I wasn't sure if the mentees would be like, how do I get into PhD programs, or like would they be focused on academia, or would they be focused on industry?
Well, I think just all of those things kind of like, what,
Gotcha.
like, because, you don't know, you can't, like, I think I said something about like it being the dark arts in terms of knowing how things translate and how you get into like a PhD program, or how you use your degree.
Yeah.
Like, you just,
The dark arts.
I mean, I think, you do develop those skills. And conversely, we've had discussions about like, that we need more people with like software engineering backgrounds in academia, because we build all the software and we don't.
Did you see the Transmitter article about neuroscience PhDs need more more software engineering training?
Not that article, but yeah.
It was just pretty funny, the posts that people had in terms of all the bad practices that they've seen.
Oh yeah.
we're pretty funny. Yeah, a folder, all your code in a folder called final, and then in another folder called really final.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The stories were pretty funny in the comments.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's because you're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
like paid to like you're not paid to maintain things too.
Right.
So you're just doing it,
Right.
through expediency, and that's so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and it's funny because it's like you would kind of hope that industry. I mean, we were special because we were in a kind of regulated, being clinical. We were developing software under ISO 9000, right? So
Okay.
it was like you had to have full traceability for all your code, which was a real crash course.
Yeah. Oh, that's because you're doing like clinical stuff, and you have to be accountable.
Yeah. I got to say, it was I don't know if it was harder for me or harder for the engineers who had 20 plus years of coding experience to get used to those. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
But
it's yeah. So that's a good discussion to have, about like the needs of in science, about like how we need to manage our infrastructure, and that was something we talked about in the
Sure.
first part of the meeting. So we in our open source meetings, and maybe you should come back to this. I think last year we talked about research software engineer. That sort of job description is something that is needed in academia. So we do a lot of software development just because we're building software to do the kinds of things we want to do with analysis. We're building systems infrastructure in our experimental design. If we use an instrument, we build something, but we don't manage it, we don't maintain it. So we have a lot of academic software packages out there that are like poorly maintained. It would be really nice if they were maintained, because sometimes they're very useful if you have like a problem and someone else has tried to solve it. So there's this need for like research software engineering, and there is an emerging field that's called research software engineering. And it's basically, we can have people who their specialization is to sort of apply best practices to building software, to maintaining it, making sure it runs, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And it's kind of an emerging area. So there are people who are giving talks on this, but there isn't like I don't know if there's like a commitment to it by, say, the funding agencies. That's that's where you'd really have to have the.
Well, certainly in the UK, it was it was essentially the research software engineers kind of gathering together to try to create some momentum for support and for visibility on the issue.
Yeah.
At least that was that's how I ran into things like the Software Sustainability Institute and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But they were doing, I forget what it was called at the time, because I was kind of helping with their social media stuff then. But yeah, I mean, it's and like Microsoft taking over. I mean, how many kind of student research repos are on GitHub or other sites, and how much. I mean, what role will Copilot always eventually have, or tools like it, in terms of I mean, there's this argument that certainly advisors have where it's just like, students need to write code. We don't want there's a respect for open source projects that provide tools for students to use. But there's also, at least, I mean, and this could be a bias from the analysis group, but like obviously, we've got to learn how to write algorithms too, and yeah. So it's like going back and forth between kind of like the educational demands and the kind of the research software engineering, like you said.
Yeah. Plus, like computer scientists will come into the project and laugh at you if you are like trained as a computer scientist and write an algorithm versus like, it's like a kind of a problem of like, well, I don't know if it's a problem of training, but like these tools are kind of being used more broadly than the sort of where they were originally designed. So like a lot of the stuff with like topological data analysis, you have tools and people build the tools and they might be like an expert in topological data analysis, but then you go to apply it to say like a brain science data set, and I want to know something about the brain. Is the tool going to match my expectations? If I modify it, is it like according to the rules of the field? And so there are all these things that you run across that.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy Howard's got a funny bit. I forget what. I don't know if this was just a recent like Twitter thread or something, but it was a pretty brutal thing about the difference between researcher algorithm development and Kaggle winners. Just that, like his great respect for Kaggle winners and the kind of approaches that come out on top. I mean, both from a coding perspective and from a chosen approach.
Yeah.
Like he seemed to suggest that we should all enter the Thunderdome to improve our to make ourselves fitter and I'm not going to do it justice, but I thought his description of it was pretty brutal, but like you said, like these are the winners, like these are the approaches that in some cases are coming out like so much better, and yet they're not necessarily using the algorithm du jour.
Yeah.
It was. I usually, no matter what you might think of his style, like, he's got a very practical head on his shoulders. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of depressing as like a researcher, you see, like, you spend all this time like developing these techniques, and then someone comes up and just throws stuff together and it works. So.
right. Yeah. Oh yeah, I just did that with XGBoost. Yeah. Right. Totally.
Yeah. So Trevor, I don't know if you are familiar with our Slack, which is another tool that we use to interact with each other.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I joined your Discord, but I don't know about the Slack. No.
Oh yeah, well the Slack would be the place to like kind of get into the more general discussions. So then there's a link on the website, the Slack invite. So you can go through that invite and see if you can join in. And then we can. I think there are a lot of conversations there that we kind of talk about in this meeting, and so it's good.
I'll check it out. Thanks. I wanted to throw a comment out as well. This perhaps is only tangentially related, but I watched a lecture by Dr. Tomas Lozano Perez. Perhaps you know him. He's an MIT robotics professor, and towards the he was talking about how to make a generalist robot. And at the end of his lecture, someone was asking him it's a question, and he answered that essentially in his mind, and he's been working in robotics forever, he thinks that the principal challenge of robotics is how to factor the data. And so as you were giving, as you were reviewing this paper, that's kind of one of the things I was just thinking of, because a lot of like especially in robotics, it comes down to like decomposing shapes, and there's a natural relationship, I think, to some of what you were saying in robotics. Anyways, I'll throw a link in the chat here if you get bored. And I don't even know if you're interested at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. So if there are no more questions, I'll finish up here with another article. Let's see where we are with this.
You doing Kevin Mitchell?
Let's see, this one maybe, yeah, this is, this was the one that Kevin Mitchell posted, or was this the other one? I can't remember. Let me see if it's in here. No, that's not it. Was this the one, Morgan, that Kevin Mitchell posted, or? I can't remember.
It's very small, so I can't read it, but if you could read out the title, it's like generative, yeah.
This is Criticality Explains Structure Function Relationships in the Human Brain. So I might actually have.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm super interested in that too. But yeah, the Mitchell one was definitely like, evolutionary, genome as like generative model, something like that. Like I can't remember the exact title, but that was the Twitter. I think I just I think I dropped a Twitter thread about that in bioevolution. I'm happy to hear about the criticality.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me mention this. So I wanted to do this in DivaWorm because it's kind of very related to what we're doing there. But this is a paper. Kevin Mitchell, of course, is a neuroscientist who's also a geneticist, and he's interested in this preprint from him and Nick Cheney, and it's called the genomic code. The genome instantiates a generative model of the organism. So this is kind of a passage from it. So how does the genome encode the form of the organism? What is the nature of this genomic code? So this is kind of highlighting that there's some common metaphors we use when we think about genes and how they contribute to the organism, especially in development or in just general, like how the genome is unpacked, the information in the genome. How does it become like a phenotype? And so there's some common metaphors that people have used, like blueprints or programs. So when you hear the term developmental program, that's usually, or developmental blueprint, that's usually, the implication is that the genes sort of serve as a blueprint to the phenotype. And so the problem with that, of course, is that it fails to capture the complex, indirect, and evolutionary dynamic relationships between the genome and organismal form and the sort of the constructive processes that produce it. So it's hard to kind of model those things using the blueprint metaphor or the program metaphor. And so we've talked about programs in computer science and how, it's like we have this program where you go line by line and it executes something. And of course, people use programs in synthetic biology. They use things like they build programs around like a bacterial genome, and they can do things like execute different functions using bacterial DNA and transcription and producing different types of macromolecules, or sometimes even some sort of phenotypic change in the bacteria. But of course, that's in bacteria, and of course you have more complex genotypic relationships, more complex phenotypes. So, we've only really been able to get a sense of running programs in bacterial systems. And so that's what he's kind of getting at here, that there's this sort of scheme that we can use that relies upon the generative model of the organism. So they build this analogy with variational autoencoders, where the genome does not encode either organismal form or developmental processes directly, but comprises a compressed space of latent variables. So these latent variables are DNA sequences. So what you do is you take the DNA sequences, you build a latent space, which means that it can have a lot of different mappings to things in the phenotype, and then you put those together as a solution. So you use that latent space to build kind of a phenotype, or you map a lot of the genes to different things that are going to come from those genes. So when we talk about a genetic genotype-phenotype relationship, that map is going to be encoded in that latent space. And then we just sample that latent space to find different ways to build the phenotype. And that matches much more with what we see with very complex genotype-phenotype relationships, say in humans, where it's, we maybe have one gene of large effect, but then we find that there are a lot of genes of very small effect. And, if we think about mental disorders or diseases, oftentimes there are these, large scale searches for the genes associated with it. And we find that maybe there's like one gene of large effect and a lot of genes of small effect that are sort of associated with that thing. And, it's hard to kind of get it, when we find genes associated with that, it's hard to understand that in terms of the statistical models that we have. So this is kind of moving in this direction of thinking about this as a generative process, but more specifically is using latent spaces to model that sort of, all the possible things that it could be, and then sampling from that latent space to find specific relationships. So, you have basically they're using a connectionist network with weights that get encoded by a learning algorithm that kind of goes through development and finds solutions. So that's basically the paper that this preprint. Yeah, this is a very intriguing approach, and I've been interested in this kind of idea of using thinking of development as a generative process, and thinking about that more specifically in terms of the representation and how that might be. We might use our models of generative AI to look at that. Okay, so our paper here, Criticality, explains structure-function relationships in the human brain. This is, I don't know, I'm not familiar with these authors, but, it's an engineering group with some biologists, medical people. So, they're kind of looking at this idea of criticality, which is this idea where, you don't have a linear response. You have sort of this critical response where you have a bunch of changes that, have to occur to reach a threshold. And then once that threshold is reached, you get this large scale response. So it's a nonlinear mapping of effects. You get these cumulative effects that are expressed as this large scale change. And that's, we think about the avalanche model, where if you drop grains of sand on a sand pile, you can have, they can fall on the sand pile and build the sand pile up. But, that introduces stresses that can be cumulative, and eventually those stresses lead to an avalanche, which is a large-scale response to these sand grains being piled up, and there are these displacements that occur at different time scales. And so the response is nonlinear. And so that's what they're getting at with criticality, and they're looking at these structure-function relationships. So, the structure of the brain, the function of the brain. I've been interested in this for a long time, this kind of notion of these critical responses in the brain. And of course, there's the critical brain hypothesis, which suggests that the brain operates at in this critical regime where you have these, effects that are nonlinear, that there are these signals that happen, that sort of accumulate in the brain, and then there are these large-scale responses either through spiking or some output of the neural network or some cognitive response. So that's what they're getting at here. And there was a whole conference, I think last year or the year before, on brain criticality that we've talked about. And so if you look up brain criticality on Google, you'll find this conference, and there were a whole bunch of talks on this where people kind of explored this topic. So let me get into the abstract here. Healthy brains exhibit a rich dynamical repertoire with flexible spatiotemporal patterns that occur at both the microscopic and macroscopic scales. So you have all sorts of patterns that are, kind of action potentials, small microcircuits, large scale circuits in the brain. And so there are different scales of activity here. And so this is where we want to capture a lot of these things. Sometimes things happen at the action potential level and they affect a microcircuit, but they don't affect the macrocircuit as much. But over time, those microcircuits change enough so that it has a sort of a nonlinear effect on the macrocircuit. So that's kind of what they're trying to understand here. How do fixed structural connections yield a diverse range of dynamic patterns and spontaneous brain activity? So how do you go from like things happening at the level of action potentials and connections in these microcircuits to large scale brain activity changes? So if we're measuring something like a EEG recording, we're observing these changes, but they're things happening at very small scales that are affecting these signals. But we want to make the connection between those. We hypothesize that the observed relationship between empirical structure and functional patterns is best explained when the microscopic neural dynamics are close to a critical regime. So in dynamical systems, again, going back to that, you have these critical regimes, you have these sort of regimes where the system is poised on the edge of chaos or poised at a sort of a phase transition. So, you usually have like a stable state, and then you have this sort of bistable state or critical state where the system is close to sort of a transition phase. So, the system can be easily tipped into a transition by, a relatively small number of changes. That's opposed to operating in a stable state where the system is basically, protected from changes in state. And that may be useful if you're in an attentional state that needs to be maintained versus when you need to shift your attention very rapidly. So you can think about this in terms of attentional resources. And I wrote a paper with some co-authors on something like that several years ago. It was published, where we looked at attentional capacity and how attentional capacity can be poised in those critical regimes where, instead of like you can focus your attention, but if you have a distractor in your environment, it can shift the system to this critical regime where it can shift into different states on demand. So this is an interesting question with respect to cognition as well as just kind of brain activity. Using a modular spiking neural network model based on empirical connectomes, so they're using data from connectomes that exist and they're building the spiking neural network model. And of course, spiking neural networks have like this aspect of action potentials. Instead of just assuming weights, you're looking at the spiking activity and they have this output of spiking. So they're different tools than your artificial neural networks. We posit that multiple stored functional patterns can transiently reoccur when the system operates near a critical regime. So we can have these functional patterns that kind of recur, and we want to maybe visit all of the different types of functional patterns as we go through our lives, as we go through dynamical behavior. Say for example, you're driving your car down the streets of San Francisco, like Morgan, and you want to be able to like detect, obstacles or, pedestrians that dart out in the middle of the street. You want to have those patterns at the ready so you can respond appropriately. And they need to be able to recur transiently. And this is the kind of thing that you want from a critical regime. You want to be able to switch between modes of activity. You want to have those patterns at the ready to implement, I guess is the way to put it, when you're in this sort of dynamical behavior. So it's very different from what we're thinking about when we think about like standard psychology experiments where you present, say, an object and people respond to it in a certain way. And then you think about those things as discrete states that you're in, and you think about maybe a focus state versus sort of a non-focus state. And we're thinking about this in terms of dynamic behavior, where there's continuous behavior, where you're having to shift your cognition, your cognitive resources, your brain activity in ways that aren't like typical, just kind of linear switches. So that's, and then of course we're thinking about structural functional relationships, and we're thinking about brain networks, and then we're thinking about how those brain networks change and unfold with this kind of dynamic, the requirements of this dynamic behavior. The connections in this model were chosen so as to force the network to learn and propagate suited modular spatiotemporal patterns, which basically means that it's forcing it to this critical regime. It's forcing it to sort of find the right pattern for the right behavior. To test our hypothesis, we employed MEG and tractography data from 5 healthy individuals. So this was a clinical study where they had MEG data, they had tractography, which is of course, looking at the structure, and MEG, which is looking at the function. We show that the critical regime of the model was able to generate realistic features and demonstrate the relevance of near critical regimes for physiological brain activity. So, this paper is very clinically oriented, and the idea that there's this long-held theory that posits that the brain self-organizes into a critical regime near the edge of a dynamical phase transition, where the balance between global inhibition and excitation play a crucial role. So, there's this aspect of criticality at the level of inhibition and excitation. There's also this critical regime at the sort of cognitive level, where you're shifting between different behaviors, different states. And so this maybe leads to functional optimality, because you can shift between different states on demand, as opposed to being stuck in a stable state, which you may need to have for certain cognitive functions or certain brain functions. But you also need to be at this sort of this critical state at the edge of 2 states, or the edge of multiple states. It has been proposed that the brain experiences both continuous phase transitions with what they call scale-free avalanches, which means that there is no sort of characteristic time interval for these avalanches. They occur at different time intervals. So if I'm poised at the sort of the boundary of many different states, I might say, well, it might make sense to look and see if you transition from state to state at a certain time interval. So you spend a certain amount of time in one state, then you switch to another state, then you switch to another state, and they roughly even out to sort of this, standard amount of time, or this mean amount of time with very little variance. And we were talking about last week non-Markovian systems versus Markovian systems, and how in Markovian systems you have this sort of random nature of exploring different states. And so there's this sort of statistical signature that is sort of highly variable. So you go into different states at different amounts of time, and there's no real sort of regularity to it. That's what they mean by scale-free avalanches. The avalanches are distributed at different time intervals, and if you sum those intervals up over time, you see that there's no characteristic time amount of time or time scale that's represented here. These avalanches occur at random, and they occur all throughout the dynamical interval that you're interested in. So we have these scale-free avalanches that occur, and we don't really know in terms of neural avalanches why they occur. They might be because you stress out your neurons, that they undergo phase transitions, and maybe there are more of them at certain times, or fewer of them at certain times, and those effects accumulate and propagate throughout the system. But we don't really know. But anyways, the outcome is that there are these scale-free avalanches. You also see discontinuous transitions. So the transition between 2 different modes of behavior, or 2 different modes of your microcircuit, are very discontinuous. they don't just easily move from one state to another. They're kind of they shift very abruptly. And these kinds of changes are beneficial to self-sustained replay activity and memory functioning. So when you're trying to consolidate memories, or when you're trying to encode a memory or recall a memory, these kinds of changes, these kind of discontinuous transitions and continuous phase transitions can be, and scale-free avalanches can all be beneficial to memory and encoding memory, retrieving memory, and so forth. So their interest here is in some in terms of memory functioning, some in terms of like kind of thinking about the topology of learning and different microcircuits and how those behave in terms of time. And, so they kind of get into a lot of that here. Let's see, their results are, they kind of talk about, it's very much both sort of talking about like plasticity, but also in terms of, Hebbian plasticity, but also in terms of these sort of dynamical systems. So you're experiencing Hebbian plasticity in these microcircuits, and there's this dynamical systems approach that they're using to sort of characterize this. This is one of these papers where the figures are in the back. So let's see if we can find some figures to talk about here. So this is the schematic representation of our network. So before learning, you have a bunch of neurons that have this leaky integrate and fire rule associated with them. And then during learning, you're building these neuronal networks that are sort of modular. They have different components that can be separated out. And there's information being transferred between them. Each neuron has this sort of plasticity that, modulates how they connect to other neurons. And so you end up with this connectivity matrix after learning that results from this process. And there's this process of learning that is, has these dynamical systems properties, basically. This shows the firing rate, and then things like the order parameter and order parameter fluctuations, which are dynamical systems descriptions of sort of these changes in firing rate due to plasticity, due to the functional needs of the network, and so on and so forth. So as the order parameter increases or decreases, that is basically a measure of the amount of order or disorder in the network. And when there's greater disorder, which is, of course, as the order parameter decreases, you get this, you're in this sort of critical state. When the order parameter increases, you're kind of affixed to one state. And the critical thing to notice here is this cycle. And this cycle between the red and the blue function here is what they call hysteresis. So where there's, when you pose a challenge to your neuronal network can respond either by maintaining its state, or it can respond by being driven closer to instability. And so when it's driven closer to instability, you get this hysteresis, which means that the response is sort of a decrease in order relative to the driving factor, which is this red function. So I drive my network by this sort of input. It's in this sort of order, it's in order, or it's increasing order. And then the response of the network can be in decreasing order, because the network can't respond appropriately to the pressures of the input. So the output is the order parameter decreases, and you end up with a system that's, needs to sort of, it decreases in order. So what will happen is your system will be poised at this sort of critical state where, no matter what the challenges of the input are, the system can provide an output that's reasonable or adaptive. And so, and a lot of times the phase transition will be an abrupt shift to account for this so that this hysteresis is lessened. So you see in the second graph, the hysteresis, the response is much closer to the input response. And so there's a less of a difference between the input and the output, or the increased order and the decreased order. And so here you see that there isn't really much of a gap at all. There's very little hysteresis, and there's, it's operating in this second order phase transition where it's made this change. And that's basically what we're looking at here. In terms of the order parameter, it's describing this ability to respond appropriately, and you want to decrease the amount of change in the order parameter over time. That's where you get into this critical region. That's where you have these phase transitions. And so these are a lot of very dynamical system-like plots where they show differences in the order parameter, fluctuations in the order parameter, and how that relates to their network. And, there are a lot of measures. You can use the Fano factor and other types of interstimulus intervals to characterize this. And I've done a little bit of work with this, but it basically describes sort of, time fluctuations in the time series and how you can account for the order parameter. And then this is a neuronal avalanche. So this is our probability versus our time scale and our spatial scale. And this shows kind of the critical region, which are the green and the blue, and the subcritical region in red. So you have this is basically a distribution of all the responses. And the neuronal avalanches have what they call a long tail. So this is where you get these responses that are low probability responses, or lower than the median response. But you get they're rare, kind of rare events that occur. And so when you get these avalanches, you get a distribution of events. This long tail describes the presence of these avalanches. So if you think about that model of the sand pile, where you're dropping sand grains on a pile of sand, sometimes you get these displacements of sand, which are these rare events in the scheme of things, but they describe, these kind of changes. And so up here, you would have like where you drop grains of sand, and it contributes to building up the pile. And there's very little change. But down here, you get this critical, these phase transitions, which is where you drop a grain of sand and it triggers an avalanche, and you get a large scale change. And those are much rarer, but they do occur, and they occur at random intervals. So it's hard to kind of predict, but it's also hard to characterize them because they're at a very, they happen at a very with a low probability. And so when you're operating in the critical region, you see a lot of these changes. When you're operating in the subcritical region, you don't see a lot of these changes because you're operating in this sort of equilibrium mode. So you can measure these neuronal avalanches, and they've actually used synthetic data for this, so you can model the changes, and you can get a sense of what they should look like, and that's what they're doing here. I know it's very hard to get your head around this, but basically this describes this kind of avalanche process, and it describes these kind of low frequency events that contribute to large scale change, and basically that's what they're describing here. Okay, I think that's enough for that paper. I think we're pretty much done with it. I just wanted to go over that. I know that you were interested in Morgan in that paper, and it seems like we're also glitching out in the session here. So I don't know if we want to finish up with any comments.
Yeah, sorry, I just got home. Amanda and I have been really interested in this particular topic, of course, and have been, we've covered in a kind of separate group. We've covered some of the papers that focus on methodological questions about, computing criticality, computing things about, system dynamics like that. And reliability of those measures, or looking across the many different measures that people use in the literature. And of course, importantly, what happens when in anesthesia regimes and things like that. You know, drug challenges and things like that. In terms of how does that how do those criticality measures change, or how do those kind of other nonlinear time series analysis measures change? And yeah, really interesting. I know I dropped that. I haven't had a look at it properly, just because I was curious about. Sorry, I also just fed. I came home, so I just fed the dogs. Yes, I hear you. I hear you. And the just in terms of how structure would come in, you know, because a lot of these have been traditionally, you know, EEG, or you know, in this case, MEG measures, you know, is really just time series measures, and so I was curious about how the structure would be important in the discussion, but maybe I could say more next week.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, let's put a pin in this and revisit it. It's a really fascinating paper, and I think they've done a good job of kind of characterizing these neuronal avalanches. So
hopefully also I'll hear back from people who attended computational neurosciences in down in Brazil,
okay,
and
wow.
see, you know, because like this would usually be, you know, a subtopic, and definitely, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a couple workshops or, you know, pre-conference things that were specifically focused on this kind of work, or, you know, particular measures, yeah, of this, yeah.
Looks like Trevor had something to say.
Oh, sorry, yeah, actually, I have nothing to say.
Okay, that's fine.
Just putting my camera back on, yeah.
Sure.
Well, anyways, yeah. So
Well, good to have you though.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for attending, and be sure, you know, to join our Slack if you're interested. And yeah, that's where we put a lot of these papers, so we'll have more conversation there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice meeting both of you as well, and yeah, hopefully we'll talk more in the future.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Have a good week.
Take care.
Take care.
Have a good week.
Thanks so much.